The action at the Kukhrina's house is rather abruptly interrupted by the mention of another woman's name, Anna Odintsova. When Bazarov hears a description of this beautiful lady, he understands, it would seem instinctively, he hasn't even seen her, he's only heard a description, but somehow something inside of him, you begin to realize that there's much more to this man than he shows on the surface, that a very different person is in view. In spite of his extreme expressions of nihilism, he obviously has a genuine sensitivity for understanding people, and you see this too when he talks to peasants, and even when he talks to Fenichka, the young woman whom Nikolai Kirsanov, I mentioned this in the beginning, the young woman whom Nikolai Kirsanov has gotten close to after the death of Arkadiy's mother and Nikolai's wife. After the two young friends, that is to say Arkady and Bazarov, actually meet Odintsova, Bazarov responds to Arkadiy's question about the first impression made by the beautiful lady, a line that's become very famous in literature. Bazarov says, "What a delectable body, perfect for the dissecting table." Just as he would dissect frogs, so he would, it seems anyway, at least in his imagination, would dissect the body of this very beautiful woman. Of course, a normal person, a normal man, when he sees the body of a beautiful woman, thinks of other things other than dissecting the body. But when Bazarov says this, the reader understands clearly that something rather different is happening inside Bazarov, something which the nihilist is finding rather uncomfortable. Well, the two of them decide to visit Odintsova's estate. It soon becomes obvious that Odintsova's beauty and intelligence have entered deeply into Bazarov's imagination. The nihilist is nowhere nearly so consistent as his arrogantly ejaculated arguments would make the older generation believe. Furthermore, he's intelligent enough to realize the genuine strength and intelligence of a beautiful woman who is obviously worthy of a far better position than a body on the dissecting table. Bazarov, of course, thinks that this is nonsense, that this is something that he has to fight, this is something he should reject. He has no time for such nonsensical things as closer, passionate relations with women. But obviously, the more he says this, the more we understand that he's attracted to her. Eventually, he opens up to show his passion for Odintsova. As a matter of fact, at one point, he lunges toward her. But she, in spite of her attraction to his powerful personality, rejects his offer of closeness. She's not ready, she says, for the complexities of a genuinely intimate relationship. And we see that Odintsova is somebody who values her comfort, values her easy life, values everything that surrounds her in that estate at least as much as she values the possibility of any kind of a close relationship with another person, much less a love relationship with as powerful a personality as Bazarov. Arkady, on the other hand, meets her younger sister, and of course, it soon becomes clear that Arkady and the younger sister are going to become very close. That is, the softness of Arkady is somehow reflected and attracted to the softness of that younger sister of Odintsova, who's, of course, a very, very different kind of a person. At this point, Turgenev takes us to another place, a still different version of the older generation. He shows us Bazarov's parents, an old-fashioned medical doctor with his wife, a warm-hearted, plump country lady who knows how to prepare and set a marvelous traditional Russian table. Turgenev describes the two of them with obvious attraction and delight. And of course, it's very interesting to see here Turgenev, on the one hand, is clearly attracted to Bazarov, and clearly exulting in the mastery that Bazarov has in the argument with the older generation. And on the other hand, when he comes to the older generation, the parents of Bazarov, he's also attracted to them. The ambivalence couldn't be more clearly stated. The conversation between the two generations here is quite different from what it was at the Kirsanov estate. Here, the older man, that is Bazarov's father, is trying to convince his son, who will also practice as a medical doctor, about the efficacy of medicine in previous days. Bazarov, you remember, Bazarov puts down anything that comes from former time. Bazarov reacts with his typical skepticism, but without the arrogance he displayed earlier. We understand that he respects what his father does, in spite of the nihilist words toward medicine in general. Bazarov has a front which will immediately put down everyone who's even slightly opposed to him, particularly in the older generation. But Bazarov has intelligence and sensitivity, which makes him realize that there's something in his father to be respected. Furthermore, it's equally clear the elder Bazarov had great respect for an earlier generation of Arkadiy's family, of the Kirsanov family, under whom the old man as a doctor had served. He brushes aside Bazarov's attempt to dismiss that generation with nihilist talk. The father is not going to listen to the son saying that, and the son almost involuntarily respects the father. Turgenev makes it clear in this scene that the work of the older generation can't simply be dismissed, even in the context of a younger generation that wants to change everything in the world. The doctor has respect for the force and energy of the young people, but he also has a decent amount of self-respect that's clearly reflected in his son. But the real literary fireworks are reserved for Bazarov's mother, a genuine Russian woman of the old school who might well have lived 200 years earlier. And again, we're getting away from the nihilist. Her evening meal was incomparable, with all the flourishes of the old school of cooking. If you've ever been at a Russian table, you know what I'm talking about. She was full of the old Russian folklore, with all kinds of superstitions expressed in marvelously spontaneous and poetic ways. She knew the devil lurked in still water, so she only washed her face in running water. You know that people who come from Russia will almost never wash their face in the water in the bathtub. It's always under the faucet. Why? Because devils live in that water, and they don't want the devils to get to them. She wouldn't eat watermelon, because when cut in half, it reminded her of the head of John the Baptist. As Turgenev interjects, such women are increasingly harder to find. God knows if that's a good or a bad thing. The reader certainly infers the positive side of that proposition. It's indicative of her strong influence on the subconscious of her nihilist son that her presence caused him to lose a night's sleep, thinking, guess what about? Of course, Odintsova and her recent rejection of his advance. The traditions which the mother, embody go very deeply into the character and the real character of the younger generation. When the young people abruptly decide to leave the parents' house, it's she who expresses what the older generation feels in losing its younger people, with the terrible sorrow, the terrible anguish of parting with the son. Clearly, Turgenev has a deep association with the feelings of this old-fashioned Russian couple. Turgenev then plunges the reader into the eternal contradictions of Bazarov's character. While upholding the stubborn consistency of his own opinions, the young nihilist managed to antagonize and even threaten physically his close friend Arkady. When they return to the Kirsanov estate, he even manages to get involved with Fenya, the young mistress of Nikolai Kirsanov. When Pavel, the aristocratic brother who's had bitter arguments with the nihilists, sees how warmly Fenya reacts to Bazarov, and Fenya always felt very strange and distant from Pavel, Pavel decides to take matters in his own hands. He'll provoke the young man to an old-fashioned duel. Bazarov realizes the very idea of a duel is absurd to a man of his principles, but he's also determined not to let himself be insulted by those condescending aristocrats. The result is a duel, which, by the way, if Bazarov had refused the duel, Pavel was carrying a heavy stick. He was ready to beat him with a stick. Bazarov said, if he had beaten me with that stick, I would have broken it over his head and beat him like a puppy. The result is a duel in which Bazarov wounds the brother, Pavel Kirsanov, and then insists on dealing with the wound as a young medical doctor would. Pavel ends up by wearing the bandage set by the person whose principle the older man hates, and Bazarov ends up by participating in the kind of behavior which his principles most deeply oppose. In short, what you have are the contradictions which Turgenev gloried in the writing that he brings forth to you. The contradictions are only ended by the death, in some ways almost a suicide, of Bazarov. In the course of the medical practice which Bazarov decides to take up, he requests his father to cauterize a cut which he had received while performing an autopsy on the corpse of a peasant who had died of typhus. Now, this is a very dangerous thing. You understand that typhus, particularly in those days, was absolutely incurable. The father pales. He realizes that if the son had touched that without gloves and with any kind of even a small cut in his hand, there was no way to prevent the son's infection with a fatal disease. And we're fated to watch the inevitable death of Bazarov, a death he could easily have avoided by following the normal medical procedure at the autopsy, that is, by sterilizing the instruments and by, of course, protecting his hands. And of course, the older generation is faced with a terrible grief of the inevitable death of their own son, whom they love so much, and who, in spite of all of his so-called principles, there's a very deep and strong connection with them. In the midst of Bazarov's final illness, Odintsova appears with a well-known German doctor in tow. Of course, German doctors were very highly respected in Russia in those days, as they probably are today. There's nothing the doctor can do, but we see in this scene Odintsova's strength in contrast to the physical downfall of Bazarov, together with the collapse of his dreams and plans. It seems almost clear that Bazarov's sloppy work as a doctor, sloppy work with the autopsy, is in part a result of his disappointment. At this point, of course, which he would never admit, but nevertheless felt deeply, his disappointment at the refusal of Odintsova when he made his advance. Clearly, her refusal has put him in what he considers to be an inferior position. She is the strong one, and she is the person coming to be merciful like Caesar to those who die. As always, in Turgenev's work, the women turn out to be the strongest people in Russia. Bazarov, of course, dies a very painful death, and the parents of Bazarov are faced with the terrible necessity of, first of all, watching the death of their son, burying their son, and then seeing his grave at the cemetery. And of course, the novel ends in a very nostalgic and a very sad way of the parents coming, the two old people coming to a cemetery, visiting the grave of their son. And of course, at this point, Turgenev turns to Pushkin, to one of Pushkin's most powerful poems. And of course, the way that Russian writers of that time used Pushkin is something quite extraordinary. Pushkin tended to think about, to brood over his coming death and try to predict the day and the time that he would die. And in one of his most famous poems, written in 1829, he says, «Брожу ли я вдоль улиц шумных, брожу во многолюдный храм, сижу меж юношей безумных, я предаюсь моим мечтам». Whether I wander along noisy streets, whether I go into a crowded temple, or whether I sit among crazy youngsters, I always give myself over to my dreams. И где мне смерть пошлет судьбина? В бою ли, в странстве, в волнах? Или соседняя долина мой примет охладелый прах? And where will death meet me? Where will my fate come? In battle? In wandering? In waves? Or will the neighboring valley receive my dust, which has already cooled down? И пусть у гробового входа молодая будет жизнь играть, и равнодушная природа красою вечною сиять. And let it happen at the entrance to my grave, let young life play, and let indifferent nature shine with its internal beauty. И равнодушная природа, indifferent nature, which blooms and fades without reference to our human feelings. He draws a conclusion that the flowers over the grave look at us with innocent eyes, which see not only the indifference of nature, but also the possibility of reconciliation and eternal life. Turgenev's own reconciliation with Russia, whose regime and flaws he often castigated mercilessly, were expressed in his famous prose poem, where he said it was impossible to believe that the magnificent and powerful Russian language was not given to a great people. Великий, мощный русский язык, нельзя поверить, что ты не был дан великому народу. It's impossible to believe that you, O magnificent Russian language, were not given to a great people.